December 1941, Tokyo. Early evening. In a quiet room filled with cigarette smoke and maps of the Pacific, Japanese naval officers stand over a table lit by a single lamp. Pins mark island chains. Arrows sweep across blue oceans. The mood is confident, calculated, certain. Across the world, American battleships still burn at Pearl Harbor. For Japan's leaders, the opening blows of the war have gone exactly as planned. The U.S. Pacific Fleet has been crippled. American territory has been struck. The enemy, they believe, is shocked, humiliated, unprepared for the scale and speed of modern war. More importantly, they believe something else: that America does not have the will to endure a long conflict. Japan's strategy rests on that assumption. Deliver rapid, stunning victories, seize territory, build a defensive perimeter so vast and costly that the United States will negotiate rather than bleed for distant islands. It is a gamble rooted not in weapons, but in psychology. Yet even as Japanese forces advance across the Pacific, something crucial is already being misunderstood. In factories thousands of miles away, production lines are accelerating. In training camps, new divisions are forming. In Washington, the question is not whether America will fight, but how long it will take to crush its enemy completely. The war has begun, and one side has already misjudged what it is truly facing. In the months leading up to December 1941, Japan stood at a strategic crossroads. For nearly a decade, the empire had expanded across East Asia through calculated aggression. Manchuria had fallen. China was locked in a grinding war that consumed men and resources but yielded no decisive conclusion. By 1940, Japan controlled vast territory, but its position was increasingly fragile. The problem was not battlefield performance. It was sustainability. Japan's industrial base was limited. Its access to oil, steel, and rubber depended heavily on foreign imports, especially from the United States. When American-led embargoes tightened in response to Japanese expansion, Tokyo's leaders faced a stark reality. Without secure access to resources, Japan's war effort would eventually grind to a halt. From this pressure emerged a fateful decision. If conflict with the United States was inevitable, then it had to be decided quickly. Japanese naval doctrine, shaped by decades of study and tradition, emphasized decisive battle. The idea was elegant and dangerous: cripple the enemy's fleet early, seize key territory, and force a negotiated peace before industrial superiority could assert itself. This logic guided planning for Pearl Harbor. The attack was not intended to destroy the United States. It was meant to shock it, to demonstrate that resistance would be costly beyond reason, to convince American leaders that reclaiming distant Pacific islands was not worth the blood and treasure required. Underlying this plan was a profound misreading of American society. Japanese intelligence assessments often describe the United States as wealthy but soft, materially strong but psychologically fragile. Many Japanese planners believed Americans lacked the cultural endurance for a prolonged attritional war far from home. They saw a nation accustomed to comfort, not sacrifice. This belief was reinforced by selective observation. The United States had emerged late from World War I. It had avoided the devastation suffered by Europe. Its population enjoyed a high standard of living even during the Great Depression. To Japanese observers, this suggested a people unprepared for the sustained hardship of total war. What these assessments missed was scale. America's industrial capacity was not merely large, it was elastic. Its political system, once mobilized, could redirect entire sectors of society toward war production. More critically, American public opinion, when unified by perceived injustice, could harden rapidly. Pearl Harbor did exactly that. Instead of dividing American resolve, it concentrated it. Within days, enlistment offices were overwhelmed. Congress declared war with near unanimity. The attack removed hesitation and replaced it with clarity. The question was not whether America would fight, but how completely it would mobilize. Japan's leaders did not immediately grasp this shift. Early successes across the Pacific seemed to validate their assumptions. Hong Kong fell. Singapore surrendered. The Philippines were overwhelmed. American forces appeared disorganized, retreating across vast distances. From Tokyo, the strategy seemed sound. The defensive perimeter expanded. Island bases were fortified. The Imperial Navy remained intact and confident. If the Americans attempted to push westward, they would be forced to fight through layers of resistance, each designed to drain morale and resources.
Yet even as Japan consolidated its gains, the foundations of its strategy were eroding. The war was not unfolding as a single decisive contest. It was becoming a test of endurance. American shipyards began launching vessels at a pace Japan could not match. Aircraft production surged. Training programs expanded relentlessly. New commanders emerged, shaped by a doctrine that emphasized flexibility, logistics, and sustained pressure rather than a single climactic engagement. Japan had planned for a short war. America was preparing for a long one. This divergence would define everything that followed. And as the Pacific War stretched from months into years, Japanese leaders would begin to confront an uncomfortable reality. The enemy they'd hoped to intimidate was not retreating. It was advancing, methodically, deliberately, and with a patience that no early victory could erase. That realization will deepen as the war moved from sweeping conquests to grinding battles over small, unforgiving islands. The stage was set for a collision not just of fleets and armies, but of assumptions. By mid-1942, the Pacific War had entered a new phase, one that Japan had not planned for in detail. The initial offensive surge had achieved much of its territorial objective. Japan now controlled a vast arc stretching from Burma through the Dutch East Indies to the Solomon Islands. On maps in Tokyo, the empire appeared secure, protected by distance and fortified positions, yet beneath this apparent dominance lay a growing strategic imbalance. Japan had won space. America was building power. The first clear signal arrived at Midway in June 1942. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, irreplaceable assets, were lost in a single battle. The defeat was not merely tactical, it was psychological. For the first time, Japanese planners confronted the reality that the U.S. Navy could strike decisively, recover quickly, and learn faster than expected. Midway did not end Japan's ability to fight, but it ended the illusion of control. From that point forward, the war ceased to be a defensive perimeter problem and became a production race, one Japan could not win. American strategy shifted deliberately. Rather than attempting to retake every lost territory, U.S. planners adopted a methodical approach that prioritized logistics, airfields, and naval dominance. Islands were selected for their operational value, not symbolic importance. Others were bypassed entirely, left isolated and irrelevant. This approach, later known as island hopping, neutralized Japan's perimeter without the need for continuous frontal assaults. Japanese commanders had expected every island to become a decisive stand. Instead, many were simply cut off. The implication was devastating. Garrisons that had been built to bleed an invader were reduced to watching the war pass them, starved of supplies and purpose. American forces did not need to destroy these units, they only needed to contain them. Time did the rest. As battles shifted to places like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and New Guinea, the character of American operations became unmistakable. Each assault was preceded by overwhelming preparation. Naval gunfire, air bombardment, logistics planning measured in weeks rather than days. When landings occurred, they were supported continuously, reinforced, resupplied, and adapted based on battlefield feedback. Japanese planners had assumed American losses would trigger hesitation. Instead, casualties triggered escalation. Where resistance intensified, American firepower increased. Where terrain proved difficult, engineers altered it. Where defenders fought to the last man, American units rotated and returned stronger. This adaptability undermined Japan's core psychological assumption. America was not seeking a quick victory. It was seeking an unavoidable one. Japanese intelligence reports began to reflect growing unease. American ship counts rose steadily, aircraft quality improved, pilot training programs expanded rather than contracted. Even after losses, U.S. operational tempo accelerated rather than slowed. The contrast was stark. Japan's pilot pool, once elite, shrank rapidly. Fuel shortages curtailed training hours. Replacement crews entered combat with minimal experience. Ships damaged in battle took months to repair, if they could be repaired at all. For every American loss, 2 replacements appeared. For every Japanese loss, the system strained further. Yet perhaps the most significant misjudgment lay not in numbers, but in resolve. Japanese leaders should believe that a society accustomed to comfort would resist prolonged sacrifice. What they encountered instead was a nation capable of reorganizing daily life around war production without fracturing politically or socially. Rationing was accepted. Long working hours became routine. Civilian industries transformed overnight. The distance between factory floor and frontline shortened until the entire society functioned as a single logistical engine. American morale did not erode under hardship, it hardened. By 1943, Japanese commanders increasingly understood the trajectory they were on.
The question was no longer whether America would push westward, but how quickly Japan could delay that advance. Defensive battles became holding actions. Victory was redefined as attrition. Strategy narrowed to prolonging the war in hopes that political conditions might change. But nothing changed. American resolve did not weaken. American production did not slow. American pressure did not relent. What Japan had misjudged was not American courage in battle. It was American patience. And patience, backed by industry, logistics, and learning, proved to be the most decisive weapon of the Pacific War. That truth would become impossible to ignore as the fighting reached islands where survival itself became the battlefield. The human miscalculation, resolve versus assumption. At the heart of Japan's strategy lay a belief about people, not about ships or aircraft, not about ranges or tonnage, but about endurance. Japanese planners assumed that American soldiers, drawn from a civilian society far removed from the brutality of total war, would falter once casualties mounted. They expected fear to outweigh commitment. They believed prolonged suffering would generate political pressure to withdraw. What they encountered instead was a force that absorbed hardship without disintegrating. American units fighting across the Pacific endured conditions as punishing as any in the war: jungle heat, tropical disease, isolation, monsoon rains. In places like Guadalcanal and New Guinea, soldiers fought as much against environment as enemy. Yet units remained operational. Morale fluctuated, but discipline held. This resilience surprised Japanese observers. Captured documents and post-war testimony reveal growing disbelief at American persistence. Units expected to be exhausted returned to the line. Forces presumed broken reorganized and attacked again. Even after heavy losses, American formations maintained cohesion. The assumption that hardship would collapse resolve proved false. American soldiers did not interpret suffering as futility. They interpreted it as obligation, something to be endured until the mission was completed. Angle 2. Tactical adaptation, learning faster than expected. Japanese commanders had also misjudged how quickly the United States could adapt tactically. Early in the war, Japanese forces exploited superior training and experience. Night attacks, infiltration tactics, and aggressive maneuver initially caught American units off guard. These methods produced early success and reinforced Japanese confidence. But American response was rapid. Doctrine evolved within months, not years. Defensive perimeters were adjusted, night fighting techniques improved, combined arms coordination tightened, intelligence sharing became routine rather than exceptional. By late 1942, American units no longer reacted blindly to Japanese tactics, they anticipated them. This shift was not the result of brilliance at the individual level alone, it was institutional. Lessons from one battlefield were analyzed, documented, and disseminated across the force. Training programs were updated mid-war, equipment was modified based on frontline feedback. Japanese forces, constrained by limited resources and rigid structures, could not match this pace of adaptation. What began as tactical surprise became predictable. Angle 3. Technology as an extension of resolve. American technological advantage did not operate independently of morale, it reinforced it. Radar, improved communications, and reliable logistics meant American units rarely felt abandoned. Even when isolated temporarily, they operated with the expectation that support would arrive. This belief shaped behavior under fire. Japanese forces, by contrast, increasingly fought with the knowledge that reinforcement was unlikely. As supply lines stretched and air superiority slipped away, isolation became permanent rather than temporary. This asymmetry affected decision-making at every level. American commanders could commit forces knowing replacement was possible. Japanese commanders conserved strength because replacement was not. Risk tolerance diverged. Initiative shifted. Technology did not simply destroy Japanese positions, it undermined Japanese confidence. Angle 4. Leadership and command philosophy. Japanese leadership culture emphasized honor, sacrifice, and obedience. These values produced fierce resistance but limited flexibility. Orders were expected to be followed regardless of changing circumstances. Withdrawal was often equated with failure rather than adaptation. American leadership philosophy differed. Commanders were encouraged to exercise initiative with an intent. Junior officers were expected to make decisions under pressure. This decentralization allowed American units to function even when communications were disrupted. Japanese commanders watching American operations noted this difference. American units did not wait passively for orders under fire. They maneuvered, improvised, and reorganized.
Loss of a commander did not paralyze a unit, another stepped forward. Leadership continuity became a force multiplier. Across these angles, human, tactical, technological, and leadership, the pattern was consistent. Japan had not underestimated American firepower, it had underestimated American resilience as a system. The Pacific War was revealing itself not as a contest of single decisive moments, but as a sustained confrontation between endurance and exhaustion. And endurance, steadily and relentlessly, was winning. This realization would deepen as the war entered its most brutal phase, where survival itself became the measure of resolve. The enemy's view, when confidence turned to dread. For Japanese commanders, the shift from confidence to concern did not happen all at once. It accumulated. Early in the war, American persistence was dismissed as temporary, an emotional reaction to Pearl Harbor that would fade once losses mounted. But as months turned into years, Japanese officers began to confront a far more unsettling pattern. American pressure did not diminish, it intensified. Reports from across the Pacific echoed the same observation. American forces returned to the offensive repeatedly, even after costly engagements. They did not pause for extended recovery. They did not wait for perfect conditions. They advanced when ready, and readiness came faster each time. Japanese planners had expected time to favor defense. Instead, time favored the attacker. This inversion was psychologically corrosive. Each month of fighting was supposed to weaken American resolve. Instead, it refined American capability. The longer the war lasted, the more dangerous the enemy became. By 1943, Japanese commanders increasingly described American forces not as reckless, but as methodical. Attacks were deliberate, preparation was overwhelming. Withdrawal by the enemy did not signal weakness, it often preceded heavier blows. What Japanese leaders feared most was no longer a single decisive battle, but inevitability. Angle 6. The moral dimension. Sacrifice versus sustainability. Japan entered the war with a belief that moral superiority had compensate for material disadvantage. The willingness to die for the emperor, to fight without surrender, and to endure extreme hardship was seen as an advantage that could not be matched by a society rooted in individual comfort. This shaped battlefield behavior. Japanese soldiers fought with extraordinary tenacity. Units often resisted until annihilated. Retreat was rare. Surrender was stigmatized. But this form of resolve came with a cost. It consumed manpower without replenishment. It discouraged adaptation. It treated survival as failure rather than continuity. American resolve operated differently. Endurance was not equated with death. It was equated with persistence. Units withdrew when necessary, regrouped, and returned. Survival was a means to continue fighting, not a moral compromise. Japanese commanders watching American operations began to question their assumptions. American soldiers did not fight to die honorably. They fought to remain effective. Over time, this distinction proved decisive. Angle 7. Logistics as the silent battlefield. Nowhere was Japan's misjudgment clearer than in logistics. Japanese planning emphasized combat performance but underestimated sustainment. Supply lines were extended across vast distances with limited protection. Industrial output could not replace losses quickly. Shipping shortages worsened with each American submarine success. American logistics, by contrast, became a weapon. Floating bases, Seabees constructing airfields under fire, supply lines measured in redundancy rather than efficiency. The American ability to move fuel, ammunition, food, and replacements across oceans dwarfed anything Japan could counter. Japanese officers did not simply observe this, they felt it.
Units ran low on ammunition, while American forces increased their firepower. Food shortages weakened defenders, while attackers ate regularly. Medical evacuation kept American soldiers alive, while Japanese wounded were left behind. Morale eroded not because courage vanished, but because reality intruded. Resolve without sustainment became exhaustion. Angle 8. The psychological breaking point, when misjudgment became acceptance. By late 1944, Japanese leadership had largely accepted the consequences of its early assumptions. The war could no longer be won, but it could still be prolonged. This shift marked the final stage of misjudgment, not about America's weakness, but about what prolongation could achieve. Leaders hoped that by inflicting enough casualties, they might influence post-war terms or delay invasion long enough for some strategic miracle to occur. Yet even this hope rested on an incomplete understanding. American resolve did not weaken under loss. It hardened. Each battle justified the next. Each sacrifice reinforced commitment rather than undermining it. The very suffering Japanese planners believed would fracture American morale instead became proof of necessity. When American forces approached the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, Japanese commanders understood they were no longer testing resolve, they were confronting it at full strength. Across every angle, Enemy perception, morality, logistics, psychology, the same conclusion emerged. Japan had not misjudged a single factor. It had misjudged the nature of modern war. A war fought not by sudden collapse, but by sustained pressure. Not by honor alone, but by systems. Not by endurance as sacrifice, but by endurance as continuity. And once that reality became undeniable, the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. The final reckoning would come not in a single moment, but in a series of battles where resolve met reality, and only one side could afford to keep going. By late 1944, the Pacific War had reached a point where miscalculation was no longer theoretical. It was visible on the map. American forces were no longer probing the edges of Japan's defensive perimeter. They were striking directly at its core. Each advance shortened distances, intensified pressure, and removed any remaining illusion that time could still work in Japan's favor. The decisive shift was not marked by a single battle. It was marked by a pattern. The return to the Philippines shattered the last major assumption underpinning Japan's strategy. Japanese planners had believed that American losses in earlier island campaigns would slow further advances. Instead, the opposite occurred. The invasion of Leyte in October 1944 demonstrated a level of coordination and scale that Japan could not counter. Naval forces operated in overwhelming strength. Air superiority was established rapidly. Supply flowed continuously. When Japanese attempts at counterattack failed, they failed decisively. Most telling was the American response to resistance. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized decisive confrontation, American forces emphasized persistence. When attacks stalled, they did not disengage permanently, they reinforced. When conditions proved costly, they adjusted methods rather than abandoning objectives. The Americans did not retreat from difficulty, they absorbed it. The Battle of Leyte Gulf exposed the final weakness in Japan's war plan. Japan committed much of its remaining fleet in a desperate attempt to disrupt the landings. The engagement that followed was vast, complex, and chaotic, but its outcome was unambiguous. Japan lost irreplaceable naval power. American losses, while significant, were absorbable without strategic consequence. From this moment forward, Japanese commanders understood that the Imperial Navy could no longer alter the course of the war. Sea control, essential to any hope of prolongation, had shifted permanently. The psychological impact was immediate. Japanese officers began framing operations not around victory, but around delay. The strategic language of command changed. Words like decisive and turning point vanished from planning documents. They were replaced by calculations of attrition and endurance. But endurance favored only one side. On land, the pattern repeated. American forces advancing through the Central and Western Pacific encountered fierce resistance, but resistance that could not stop momentum. Japanese defenders fought with determination, but their sacrifice did not produce strategic effect. Positions were taken, bypassed, or rendered irrelevant through isolation. What Japanese commanders had hoped would exhaust American morale instead revealed its depth. American soldiers continued advancing after losses. Units rotated and returned. Commanders planned operations assuming resistance would be heavy, and executed them regardless. The expectation of American withdrawal after high casualties proved false again and again. The turning point then was not a moment of collapse. It was a moment of recognition. Japanese leadership recognized that American resolve was not a variable to be manipulated. It was a constant. No level of suffering imposed at the tactical level altered American strategic commitment. Each battle strengthened justification for the next. Each loss reinforced the necessity of completion. The logic of deterrence had failed. By early 1945, this realization hardened into certainty. The United States was no longer simply advancing. It was closing. Distances shortened, targets multiplied, Japan's defensive depth evaporated. Even as Japanese forces prepared for final resistance, they did so with the knowledge that outcome was fixed. The war was entering its final phase, and it would be decided not by who could endure most suffering, but by who could sustain pressure longer. Japan had built its strategy on the belief that America would not. Reality had proven otherwise. That truth would now be tested in the most brutal battles of the Pacific War, where every remaining assumption would be stripped away under the weight of inevitability. By early 1945, the Pacific War no longer revolved around uncertainty. It revolved around acceptance. Japanese commanders did not suddenly lose the will to fight. What they lost was the belief that fighting harder could change the outcome. The strategic center of gravity had shifted permanently, and no single battle, no matter how costly, could move it back. That realization crystallized in the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Iwo Jima was not large. It offered no population to liberate. It was, in purely territorial terms, insignificant. But to Japanese planners, it represented something critical. Proof. If American forces could be broken anywhere, it would be here. The island was fortified with extraordinary care, underground defenses, interlocking fields of fire, and a command philosophy designed to maximize casualties rather than hold ground. The intent was not to win, but to shatter American resolve through loss. The result was catastrophic for Japanese assumptions. American forces did not retreat. They advanced yard by yard, absorbing losses that would have broken most armies. Units rotated forward. Engineers rebuilt terrain under fire. Supplies never ceased. Command never collapsed. Japanese defenders fought with determination, but they fought alone, cut off, unsupplied, and facing an enemy that could afford to persist. When the island finally fell, the strategic lesson was unmistakable. Even extreme sacrifice could not deter American advance. Okinawa reinforced that lesson on a larger scale. The battle was prolonged, brutal, and psychologically exhausting for both sides. Japanese commanders committed every remaining resource to slow the invasion. Kamikaze attacks intensified. Ground resistance hardened. Civilian populations were drawn into the catastrophe. Yet despite unprecedented casualties, American operations continued. The advance paused, but did not reverse. Command structures adapted. Reinforcements arrived. Logistics compensated. Even under the strain of sustained combat, American formations remained operational. For Japanese leadership, Okinawa ended all remaining illusions. If American resolve entered here, under these conditions, then nothing left could stop it. What Japan had misjudged was not American courage. It was American inevitability. Resolve backed by production, logistics, and organizational learning does not need dramatic victories. It only needs time.
and time, once secured, becomes decisive.
By mid-1945, Japanese commanders no longer debated whether America would continue the war. They debated how to survive its conclusion. The Pacific War had become a one-directional force. American industry replaced losses faster than they occurred. Training pipelines continued uninterrupted. Commanders gained experience without exhausting their armies. The system functioned even under stress. Japanese resistance, by contrast, consumed itself. Every battle reduced options. Every sacrifice narrowed possibility. Courage remained, but agency did not. The war had reached its point of no return. This was the true turning point of the Pacific War. Not Pearl Harbor, not Midway alone, not any single landing, but the moment Japan understood that American resolve was not conditional. It did not depend on cost, it did not depend on speed, it did not depend on early success. It depended on completion. And once that truth became clear, the end of the war was no longer a matter of strategy, it was a matter of time. The final phase would not be shaped by misjudgment, but by consequence, by the full weight of a war Japan could no longer influence, only endure. That weight would now fall upon Japan itself. By the summer of 1945, the consequences of Japan's original assumptions were no longer abstract, they were everywhere. The Pacific theater had been transformed from a contest of maneuver into a closing vice. American forces controlled the seas. American aircraft dominated the skies. American logistics reached farther and faster than Japan's shrinking defenses could respond. What remained of Japan's war effort was reactive. The collapse of Japan's outer defensive perimeter had created a strategic vacuum. Islands that once formed a layered shield now stood isolated, bypassed, or neutralized. Garrisons that had been expected to bleed the enemy instead watched the war move past them, unable to influence events. Supplies dwindled, communications failed, morale eroded under the knowledge that relief would never come. Japanese commanders increasingly faced a grim choice: fight to extinction where they stood, or wait. Neither option offered victory. American operations now reflect total confidence in outcome. Campaigns were planned not around desperation or urgency, but around efficiency. Airfields were constructed within days of landings. Harbors were cleared and expanded. Supply depots grew steadily larger behind advancing lines. The battlefield no longer dictated American movement dictated the battlefield. This shift was deeply unsettling for Japanese leadership. For years, Japanese strategy had relied on forcing the enemy into costly frontal assaults. By 1945, American forces chose when and where to fight. Resistance did not halt advance, it shaped the timing, and timing always favored the side with resources. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was severe. Reports from frontline units increasingly emphasized isolation rather than objectives. Commanders described positions that could not be reinforced. Units reported ammunition shortages even before engagement. Medical supplies ran out. Wounded soldiers remained untreated. Courage persisted. Hope did not. At the highest levels, Japanese leadership now confronted the full implications of its early misjudgment. The assumption that America would seek negotiation after suffering losses had been catastrophically wrong. Instead of fracturing under pressure, American society had unified. Instead of limiting commitment, the United States had expanded it to unprecedented levels. The longer the war continued, the stronger the American position became. Time, once expected to erode American resolve, had done the opposite. For American soldiers, the war's final phase felt different. There was no sense of uncertainty about outcome, only concern about cost. Units advanced with professionalism shaped by years of combat. Losses were mourned but not allowed to derail operations. Systems remained intact. Confidence in leadership and logistics endured. The American war effort did not depend on desperation, it depended on completion. Japanese commanders increasingly framed resistance in moral rather than strategic terms. Holding ground was no longer about altering outcome, it was about preserving honor. Delaying advance was no longer about victory, it was about demonstrating resolve. This shift marked the final collapse of strategic agency. The war could no longer be shaped, it could only be endured. The realization that Japan had fundamentally misjudged its enemy now framed every remaining decision. American resolve had not weakened under hardship, it had matured. And with that maturity came inevitability. The Pacific War was no longer a struggle between equals, it was a countdown. The final consequences, political, military, and human, would now unfold rapidly as Japan faced the full weight of a war it could no longer stop. Those consequences would define not only the war's end, but its meaning. As 1945 progressed, the consequences of Japan's misjudgment accelerated faster than even its most pessimistic commanders had anticipated.
What once been a broad, multi-layered defensive strategy was now reduced to a shrinking core. Each American advance removed options rather than creating new ones. Every island lost shortened distances. Every airfield captured extended American reach. The geography of the Pacific itself began to work against Japan. There was nowhere left to retreat that mattered. American pressure no longer arrived in waves, it arrived continuously. Carrier task forces operated with impunity. Submarines severed Japan's remaining supply lines. Strategic bombing intensified, striking industrial centers and transportation hubs with growing precision. The cumulative effect was not sudden collapse, but systemic failure. Japan's economy strained under blockade and bombardment. Fuel shortages crippled training and movement. Aircraft production fell behind losses. Even when planes were available, pilots were not. Experience could not be replaced at the pace required. Japanese commanders understood the significance of this imbalance. They were not losing because of a single defeat. They were losing because the structure of the war no longer allowed recovery. On the battlefield, resistance became increasingly symbolic. Units fought with determination, often to the last man, but their sacrifices no longer delayed American operations in meaningful ways. Positions were taken, bypassed, or isolated according to operational need. American planners no longer felt compelled to eliminate every pocket of resistance. Containment was enough. Time did the rest. Within Japan's leadership, discussions shifted decisively. Military councils no longer debated victory conditions. They debated survival conditions. The question became how to end the war without complete annihilation of the nation itself. Even as public rhetoric emphasized resolve, private understanding acknowledged inevitability. The early belief that America could be shocked into withdrawal now appeared tragically naive. American resolve had not been a temporary reaction, it had been structural. For American soldiers, the cost of this misjudgment became unavoidable. Bombing campaigns reached cities with devastating effect. Infrastructure collapsed, food shortages worsened. Daily life became a struggle for survival. The distance between battlefield and home front vanished. The war Japan had hoped to keep far from its population arrived with full force. American forces, by contrast, advanced with a grim sense of responsibility. Commanders understood that victory was assured, but at a cost measured in lives. Operations were planned to minimize unnecessary losses, not because resolve wavered, but because endurance did not require recklessness. The system that had carried the United States across the Pacific now focused on finishing the war decisively. American resolve did not fade as the end approached, it sharpened. When Japan finally faced the reality of surrender, it did so under conditions shaped entirely by that resolve. Negotiation was not driven by battlefield stalemate, it was driven by exhaustion under pressure that would not relent. The misjudgment that had launched the war now defined its conclusion. Japan had assumed America would tire of sacrifice. Instead, America endured long enough to make further resistance meaningless. The Pacific War ended not because Japan lacked courage or because its soldiers failed to fight. It ended because strategy built on misunderstanding cannot survive contact with reality forever. And reality, relentlessly and methodically, had proven one truth beyond dispute. American resolve was not a weakness to be exploited. It was a force that once awakened did not stop. That realization closed the war's final chapter and set the stage for its lasting lessons. The Pacific War did not end with a single moment of realization. It ended with accumulation. Each island lost, each convoy sunk, each pilot missing from roll call, each city reduced to ash. Together they formed a pattern that could no longer be denied. Japan had not simply underestimated American strength, it had misunderstood American character. That misjudgment shaped everything that followed. American resolve was not rooted in impulse or rage alone, it was grounded in structure. Industry that could sustain loss, logistics that could absorb distance, institutions that could rotate men without breaking cohesion, and a society that accepted sacrifice as a sharing burden rather than an individual tragedy. Once mobilized, that system did not search for exit ramps, it advanced. For Japan, the lesson arrived too late. Strategic brilliance at the tactical level could not compensate for a war fought against arithmetic. Courage could not replace fuel. Discipline could not substitute for production. Tradition could not overcome skies controlled by an enemy who learned, adapted, and returned stronger after every setback. The Pacific became a proving ground for modern warfare's central truth. Wars are no longer decided by singular moments of daring, but by sustained capacity over time. The human cost of this realization was immense. Millions paid for assumptions made years earlier. Soldiers fought on long after outcomes were decided. Civilians suffered consequences they had never chosen. Leaders confronted endings shaped by their earliest beliefs. History remembers the battles, but it should also remember the errors of judgment that made those battles inevitable. American resolve did not emerge as myth, it emerged as process. A nation shocked into unity, a military transformed by necessity, a population that absorbed loss and continued forward, not because war was welcomed, but because withdrawal was unacceptable. That distinction mattered. It still does. The Pacific War's final lesson is not about dominance, it is about consequence. When a nation mistakes restraint for weakness and patience for fragility, it risks awakening a force it cannot contain. Japan learned this not in theory, but across thousands of miles of ocean, under skies it no longer controlled, against an enemy it could no longer slow. Resolve, once tested and proven, reshapes history. In the Pacific, it decided the war, and long after the guns fell silent, it remained the clearest answer to the question Japan had once believed it already understood.